When Troy Denning was asked to write a trilogy about Han Solo, Leia Organa, and Luke Skywalker, he knew that it needed to be different than the 19-book New Jedi Order series that preceded it. When the series concluded with The Unifying Force by James Luceno in 2003, the entire galaxy had suffered 5 years of war at the hands of the Yuuzhan Vong. So Denning made the decision to set the Dark Nest trilogy 5 years after the New Jedi Order series, so that there was a definite break between the galaxy-wide events that occurred then and the much smaller scale events of his trilogy. That also meant that he had to figure out what had happened to the galaxy and the Jedi Order in those intervening 5 years, which is a lot of the setup as the novel opens. And since the Dark Nest trilogy was released in the second half of 2005, with The Joiner King coming out in July of that year, we also have some prequel-era revelations as well. I had blanked out a lot of the events of the Dark Nest trilogy, and really all I remembered was that it had bugs in it. Small bugs, big bugs, giant bugs, and as Han says in this book, why did it have to be bugs? So, a brief summary. Luke Skywalker is worried because 7 of his young Jedi Knights, including his nephew and his niece, have disappeared into the unknown regions following an unknown cry for help. Now the Chiss have lodged a formal complaint with the Galactic Alliance that the Jedi are meddling into a border dispute between the Chiss and an unknown aggressor. So Luke Skywalker and his family, as well as Han Solo and Leia Organa Solo, head off to the unknown regions to find out what's going on. But the situation they stumble into is even more mysterious and dangerous than they had imagined. So since the Dark Nest trilogy picks up 5 years after the Unifying Force, a lot of things have changed in the galaxy in the meantime. And I really appreciated that because you can't just pick up where things left off when Coruscant was partially terraformed into a new world, planets were dead, people were displaced, the Yuuzhan Vong had to all be relocated to Zonama Seacoast, so there's a lot going on here. And some of my favorite stories are the logistics of what happens after these great battles. There is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe fanfiction called Carpetbaggers, which is like one of my favorite stories, where after you defeat the evil, then what do? Because you have to somehow reform a government, get things functioning properly, when all you've known is war, or in the case of Narnia, all you've known is 100 years of winter. So I liked in the beginning getting to see that there are corporations who are finding unpopulated planets and making a profit off of it. That Han and Leia are desperately trying to find a new home for the Ithorian people. The loss of their homeworld was one of the first great tragedies of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, and they're coming up against bureaucracy. Luke has relocated the Jedi Academy to Ossus, that the Jedi headquarters is on Coruscant, but he's starting to wonder if they are too closely entwined with the Galactic Alliance, and that the Jedi Knights are spread very thin trying to do peacekeeping and stopping pirates, and it's building up to tension between different factions in the Jedi Order like we saw at the beginning of the New Jedi Order series. But unfortunately, a lot of that stuff is dropped and is no longer in the forefront once the book really focuses on the conflict between the Chiss and the Killik. And understandably, Luke and Mara and Han and Leia are worried about what's happening with their family, what's happening with the young Jedi, what's happening with this weird joiner hive mind state. And so we get less of that. We do get a little bit of the politics and more of the just like Jedi being mad with each other, but like that rebuilding the galaxy and the fact that 5 years in they're still not even close to finishing it isn't as important. Which some people probably are happy about because they're here for a Star Wars book. They want an adventure, they want fighting and dogfights and all that, but here's me liking reconstruction of the galaxy. So essentially the plot is this. 7 Jedi who are all part of the Merker mission disappeared to the unknown regions because they've been hearing a cry for help. Next thing the Jedi Order knows is that the Chiss show up on Coruscant and they're like, stop getting involved in our border conflict. And they're like, what border conflict? So Luke and Mara Jade Skywalker and their young son Ben, as well as separately Han Solo and Leia Organa Solo and Saba Sabatine, the Jedi Master, they all head out towards the unknown regions to figure out what happened. And what happened is that the Killiks, the insectoid species that had populated Alderaan before the humans arrived, and which we first got a hint of in Tatooine Ghost with the Killik Twilight painting that Leia is so desperate to reacquire. They're still alive, and they're out in the unknown regions, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they've just started, I guess, progressing. Their civilization is changing. They've learned how to be medic, so their population is really exploding. And as it explodes, they take over new planets, and they're getting close to the Chiss. And at first, we're not sure really what's going on with the Chiss here because they're not actually in Chiss territory. They're just butting up against it. And usually the Chiss don't attack unless they've been attacked first. But we learn that, like, some of the Chiss ruling family became part of the Joiner hive mind, and so the Chiss are just really frustrated with the Killiks right now. And the leader of the Killiks, the titular Joiner king, is Raynar Thul, who was last seen in Star by Star in the shuttle that the Dark Jedi stole as they were going away from the world ship. He is a lot different than we last saw him, and not just because he's had some grievous, like, facial wounds from going through a fire, but he's part of the hive mind. He no longer sees himself as a person, but just part of the Killiks, and that he speaks for them. And at one point, it's almost like there's a psychotic break between the Raynar that was and the Thul that speaks for this big Killik group. And the young Jedi who answer the call have also become part of that hive mind. They're joiners now. They can pick up on each other's thoughts, but also the thoughts of the Killik hive as a whole. And that's really creepy to me, especially how it plays out with Jaina and Zekk's relationship. Zekk has this unrequited affection for Jaina, and Jaina doesn't reciprocate it, and they're just friends. But with the Killiks, it's almost like they become one mind, and they finish each other's sentences, and it's uncomfortable. It definitely makes Han uncomfortable, and when they encounter him, makes Jagged Fell uncomfortable, and it makes me, as the reader, uncomfortable, because especially in the case of Jaina, this is a very strong-willed individual whose individual consciousness has been swallowed up into this hive mind, and she pushes back against it, but Raynar, as the Thul, is so strong that he just overpowers her most of the time, and it makes her seem weaker than I expected her to be. Part of Jaina's appeal is that Jaina is very much like Han. She just does her own thing, and if you tell her one thing, she'll maybe do 180 degrees from it. And of the Solo kids, she is sometimes the hardest to reason with. To see her so completely unlike herself and so subsumed by this hive mind personality was upsetting for me to read. Some of the other Jedi are obviously doing Thul's business. Like Tazar goes off to negotiate with Raynar's mother's company. Jacen, of all the Jedi, seems the least subsumed by this hive mind. He's still able to separate himself from that just, like, overwhelming consciousness. I guess one detriment, though, for me was that at the end of the Unifying Force, Jacen said he was going off on a journey of self-discovery. He wanted to learn about other Force traditions and travel around the galaxy. And I really love that idea of, like, Jacen the traveler, Jacen the learner. But because the Dark Nest trilogy picks up 5 years after the Unifying Force, we don't see any of that. We see the moment where he first decides to answer the call, and he's been training with the Fallen Nasi and Akana, and he leaves. And we see some of the abilities he's picked up, his ability to move through time with the Force and see past events, and then also talk to his mother in the future briefly, which is very interesting. But I did feel a sense of regret that, like, there's this whole story of Jacen's odyssey that is missing just because of when this story is set. And I know that she becomes a villain as the books progress, but I was rather disappointed by Troy Denning's portrayal of Alema Rar. When we first met her in Star by Star, she gave us our first glimpse into the Voxen, and they killed her sister, Numa Rar. And Luke had a weird line in that book, which I later forgot, but it was something along the lines of, she's going to turn to the dark side. It's not just a question of if, it's a question of when. And in this book, Alema is the only one of the Jedi Knight joiners who becomes part of the Dark Nest. The nest that was taken over by, presumably, Lomi the Dark Jedi. And it's because of her anger that she is susceptible to it. And Luke brings that up again, like, well, all those years back I said this, and I was like, what? I feel like to say that a character is destined to fall to the dark side, I feel takes away their personal responsibility for themselves and their actions, because you can argue, well, it's not her fault, she was destined to fall, and like, no, that's a choice she made, and I don't appreciate that. And also, Alema is really sexualized, more so than any other character in this book, and it's written off as she's a Twi'lek, she had been a slave, this is just how she dresses and how she acts. But it makes me uncomfortable to read that she's constantly in a state of partial undress, that in one scene when they have to put on hazmat suits, she puts one on that's purposely 2 sizes too small so that it's skin tight, and like, it's a hazmat suit, what the heck? Let's not even get into the fact that the Killiks, like, go off into these harem groups, and so reading between the lines, like, the joiners are doing this as well. Ugh. I don't like it. Nope. Don't want to think about that. I noticed with Luke and Mara, but really with all the Jedi as a whole, that they're all very angry. And they use their anger with their Force ability. And they justify it by saying that Vergere taught that the Force is not divided into light and dark, so they can use that whole spectrum of emotions. And okay, I'll save this for the issues bit, but that is something that I definitely have problems with. But I did appreciate that their son, Ben, is refusing to use the Force, and they're not pushing him about it. They're letting him decide on his own terms when that's something he would be comfortable with using or not. I did feel like they were more lenient with him than I would expect, especially when he acquired one of those Dark Nest Killiks and was hiding it. But I think when they have the example of how Han and Leia raised their children, which they couldn't help, it was part of the circumstances in which they were living, they've sort of tried to go the opposite way and bringing Ben along with them all the time and involving him in things and listening to things. So I did feel at times like that kid needs to be reprimanded, but I could see why they weren't doing so. And finally, I think that Denning writes Han and Leia very well. I'm not sure if they're his favorite characters, but I suspect they are. And that was one of the reasons that I liked Tatooine Ghost so much, because I felt like he had a good grasp on their relationship and their dynamic, and it came through really well. And here in The Joiner King, after going through all that drama in the New Jedi Order series, they've grown into a stronger relationship. So I really like the rapport that they show here, that Han is worried about Jaina, and he's understandably upset that there are bugs, and Leia's there to support him, and he worries that by being his co-pilot, she's being held back from greater things she could be doing political-wise. But as the book ends, she tells him, I don't want to do that political stuff anymore. I want to train to be a Jedi and spend time with my husband. And it's just nice to see. So my first issue with The Joiner King is that there's a lot going on here because it has to set up the trilogy, but it is not considerably, but noticeably bigger than the other 2 books in the trilogy. And I felt like we have a number of characters that, especially new characters, that I just wasn't as crazy about, like Jejun the Celestin and his Ewok co-pilot. And they're interesting, but they're there for a lot of it. They're like Han and Leia's introduction to the Killiks, and then they're there the whole time. And there's this ongoing gag where Jejun is very by the books and Han isn't, and they don't get along super well. And this was definitely a your mileage may vary situation where I wasn't crazy about Jejun, and so just the fact that he was in so much of the book was a little bit of a downside to me. I don't like bugs, and just the concept of human-sized bugs, and the fact that the joiners, like Jaina and Zekk, are letting bugs crawl around in their clothes, and that is straight up nightmare fuel for me. The hive mind, I don't like it. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. The fact that some of the characters seem to be okay with it, and it's really only Han who's like so pushing back about the wrongness of this, worries me a little. And on a scale of Tatooine Ghost to Star by Star, violence-wise, torture-wise, the Joiner King isn't like Star by Star level, but it's a lot more than Tatooine Ghost. And if I were to say like how much violence and torture I like in my books, I'm on the Tatooine Ghost level, where like I don't want really any of it. And we have stuff like Saba getting into the fight with Welk, and then she has part of her brain exposed. And then towards the end, when Luke and Mara are fighting the Dark Nest, and just like Mara has a giant hole in her abdomen, and the fact that Raynar and Lomi and Welk went through this fire and like their ears and their nose burned off. I've said in my New Jedi Order retrospective that like I don't like body horror, and some of this was getting a little too close to body horror for me. And it doesn't help that I don't like bugs, so like body horror plus bugs, no. I think my biggest issue is that Denning is setting up this dilemma that after adopting Verger's view of the Force, the Jedi are moving in the wrong direction, and it is building to this boiling point, and something's going to have to be done. And this was one instance where I felt like Denning was interpreting what Verger told Jacen completely different than I did. And I don't know who's right, if I'm right or if Denning's right, or if both of us are wrong and Stover had a completely other idea in mind. But how I saw it was that, yes, the Force itself is not dark or light. What is dark or light is your actions and how you use the Force, and that Force abilities in themselves, you wouldn't put them on a list and say, this is dark, this is light, this is dark, this is light. But what matters is, what are your motivations? Why are you doing this? Are you using the Force because of selfish means? Are you trying to hurt people? And that's why I said that all the Jedi being angry and using their anger to fuel their Force abilities sat wrong with me. And I can understand that after 5 years of war, that there are some Jedi who did things they shouldn't have done, skirted very close to the edge, that there may be a problem within the Jedi Order of Jedi arguing that the ends justify the means. It doesn't matter how I do it as long as I get the right result. But I always thought that what Verger taught Jacen was less about allowing you to do whatever you want as long as you think you're doing the right thing, and more because Jacen was so worried that he was going to accidentally, inadvertently fall to the dark side that he wasn't willing to take any action at all. And that what Verger taught him was that it's all on you. It all comes down to what you do and why you do it and for what reason. And that's what makes it dark or light, that the Force is not divided right down the middle, that you have to take personal responsibility for your actions. I guess it basically boils down to, I can see why Denning has the Jedi Order behaving in this way, and that it has the potential for lots of dramatic possibilities, and that there will be all these arguments and things will come to a head. But that's not how I interpreted what Verger taught Jacen, so it just feels like I'm approaching this in a completely different way than Denning is. And because I don't have that same view of the Force, I can't 100% buy into what he's saying here, because in the back of my mind, I'm like, no, No. So as the Joiner King ends, we have a conclusion for now. The border dispute with the Chiss has been avoided because Leia talks Thul around to moving the Killik nest to another location. But she wasn't able to outright reason with him because he's still has trouble accepting the existence of that dark nest led by Lomi. Zekk and Jaina and Lobaka are no longer part of the nest, but they still have that hive mind going. And we never actually saw Lomi, and presumably she and her nest have escaped. So it's like a conclusion for now, but there is obviously more for the books to deal with. So, in short, I wasn't sure what to expect when I reread the Dark Nest trilogy, because I had forgotten a lot of it. Understandably so, because I hate bugs. And the truth was that there are a lot of bugs. It is more violent than I would like, and I find the hive mind aspect of the story very uncomfortable to read. But at the same time, I do like Han and Leia's arc here. I love how well they've grown to work together, and I like getting to see Luke and Mara and Ben as a family, even if I do have some quibbles about that as well. I guess my main warning, at least for book 1 of the Dark Nest trilogy, is that even though it's 5 years after the New Jedi Order, I feel like a lot of that darkness still carries over. This may not be a galaxy-wide conflict, but it's not light and fluffy. So next time I'm going to be reading the second book in the Dark Nest trilogy by Troy Denning, The Unseen Queen.